Hi everyone, my name is Steve Fleming, and I'm going to be telling you about the higher order state space model of consciousness. So I'm a psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist at UCL, where I run the metacognition group. I'm also a principal investigator at the Functional Imaging Lab in Queen's Square, a group leader at the Max Planck Center for Computational Psychiatry, and also a fellow of the CFAR program in brain, mind, and consciousness. And I have a long-standing interest in computational models of metacognition and consciousness and interactions between the two. A starting point for the modeling work we've been doing in my lab is this simple observation. Sensitivity is not the same thing as sentience. Things such as cameras, thermometers, plants, and so on can be sensitive to aspects of their environments without necessarily being conscious of what they are sensitive to. And this is also the case in the human brain, where information processing can occur without awareness, as in the case of blindsight or neuroimaging experiments demonstrating neural encoding of stimulus features without the subject being aware of the stimulus. This then leads us to the question of what kind of neural processes support conscious as opposed to unconscious perception. The broad class of higher order theories of consciousness address this question by proposing that consciousness ensues when a first-order state is monitored or meta-represented by a higher-order representation. So under this view, a first-order representation of some content X is not sufficient for a conscious experience of X to arise. But what does this mean in computational terms? The higher-order state space model, or HOS, is one of a class of models which aims to define some minimal computational properties of this kind of meta-representation. The starting point for HOS is a probabilistic graphical model of the sort that you might be familiar with in your tutorials on perception. The idea that the brain is trying to invert a model of its sensorium. But HOS and other computational higher-order theories claim that this is not enough for awareness. That model inversion will give you first-order representations, but not conscious experience. Instead, HOS proposes that we become aware of the content represented in the model when it is tagged as being a reliable reflection of the outside world by an additional higher-order state. Mathematically, this can be done by computing the posterior probability of signal being represented in the first-order model, marginalizing over the contents of those first-order states. This is similar to Hak-Quan Lau's perceptual reality monitoring view, in which consciousness is a process of trusting our perceptual signals. A key benefit of this architecture is that we can readily capture the combinatorial flexibility of human awareness. We can be conscious to differing degrees of a wide variety of perceptual contents, being aware of the smell of baking or partially aware of a headache. Now, the models we'll look at in today's tutorial are static snapshots. But a more realistic model is that these higher-order states are dynamically estimating the reliability of first-order representations over time. And this may account for the empirical observation by Michael Herzog and others that consciousness is surprisingly slow and smeared out over time. The model also makes empirical predictions about the kinds of neural processes that support inference on first-order and higher-order states. In particular, the model predicts that first-order state representations should be high-dimensional, and there should be an asymmetric coding of first-order content, with rich content when the higher-order state detects signal versus noise. In contrast, the higher order state should be lower dimensional and should symmetrically encode the magnitude or precision of the first order states, either saying that it can trust what the first order model is representing or saying that it cannot trust it and that it's unaware of any content. Nadina Dijkstra in my group has recently tested some of these predictions using functional MRI and a simple visual detection task. She found that the signatures of inference at the first order level are nicely captured by activations in the visual cortex. That's the image on the left-hand side here. Whereas signatures of inference at the higher order level were expressed in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. There's a nice side benefit of this model architecture. First of all, it allows us to use the first order model for simulation, imagination, and planning without confusing those internal simulations for reality. If I start imagining a tiger is in my office, I don't want to suddenly perceive that a tiger is really in my office. So higher order representations may be useful for keeping apart reality and imagination. Formally, the Haas model can be simulated as a probabilistic graphical model, where the middle layer, this W layer here, encodes the first order perceptual content, and the upper layer, the A layer, encodes the lower dimensional higher order state. Now, the state space in a realistic first order generative model is likely to be rich and flexible and high dimensional, similar to the kind of deep generative model architectures you've encountered elsewhere in this course. But to simulate the key principles, we can rely on a much simpler state space. And in the tutorials, for simplicity, we're going to generate sensory data in a two-dimensional feature space, shown on the right-hand side here, where one axis, here, signals evidence for a right-tilted grating, and the other axis here signals evidence for a left-tilted grating. We can then create Gaussian likelihoods for three stimulus classes in this space: a likelihood for the right-tilted grating, the left-tilted grating, and the absence of any grating, which would be low activation on both of the dimensions. Now, the higher order state space up here, this A level, is then built on top of the first order architecture. Now, there are a number of different ways of setting this up, but a simple way that we will implement in the tutorial is to allow the higher order state to encode whether or not the first order model is signaling content, in this case left or right tilted gratings, versus noise. A first set of simulations will pump the intuition for the model and explore how we build this crucial higher order state. A second set of simulations will calculate the prediction error at the two levels of the model, and this calculation makes the assumption that the average prediction error at a given level of the model is proportional to the Kullback-Leibler divergence between prior and posterior. And the tutorial will guide you through a simulation that samples this KL divergence term at the first order and higher order levels as a function of the different inputs to the model and the kinds of decisions it makes. We'll then see each other afterwards for a short outro video where we consider how these simulations map on to neural signatures of ignition.